all, so many of our communities. Taneeza was very instrumental in re-engaging my political engagement and just involvement and participation. And she definitely was one of the people who talked me into just getting re-involved. And I'm happy to be here tonight to listen to her speak. So thank you, Taneeza, for coming tonight.
And we also have our vice chair of the South Dakota Democratic Party on here as well. Nikki, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. For those who don't know me, I'm Nikki Gronley, vice chair of the state party. I live outside of Del Rapids in rural South Dakota, and I work for a technology company in Sioux Falls. And an interesting story, Taneeza and I were part of the group of women that started an organization called LEAD, which was specifically created to try to be more inclusive and get diverse populations to run for office. And so I actually was on a LEAD meeting with Taneeza last night, and it's great to see her again today.
Well, thank you, Nikki. And also Carl Peterson, who is also an Oceti Sakowin Caucus member, is on too. So we're really honored for everyone that's joined us this evening. Just to give you a small background of the Oceti Sakowin newly formed caucus of the South Dakota Democratic Party. We represent all 9 tribes of South Dakota. We are here to increase representation and participation with South Dakota's political landscape. And we believe that, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota values closely align with the Democrat values more than any other political party. And so we're here to create a safe space. We're here to learn. We're here to stay engaged and create, some healthy discussion and raise awareness to issues that matter to not only Indigenous people, but also, Democrats across the state. And so we're really honored and happy to have Taneeza Islam with us this evening. And so I would like to introduce Taneeza. She is a first-generation American Muslim immigration lawyer who has called Sioux Falls her home since 2012. And she has her own private immigration law practice. She began in 2013 after receiving a Bush Foundation Leadership Fellowship. And so we're really honored to have her. She's also co-founded South Dakota Voices for Justice and its sister organization. So I would like to introduce Taneeza Islam.
Tante Washte Nape Chiyu Zapi. Thank you for having me here today, and to my colleague Megan, who's on this call, to help me learn some Lakota. So that was really fun for me today. Thank you again for the introduction and having me on this call. I'm really excited about this conversation and where it could lead. So as mentioned, my name is Taneeza Islam. I am an immigration attorney, but in 2017, I rolled my private immigration law practice into the nonprofit, which is now South Dakota Voices for Peace. So we have sister organizations. Voices for Peace, which is our green logo, is our C3 organization, where we do education, rapid response, free legal services, storytelling about immigrant and refugee communities specifically in our state. And then our C4 entity, which is our blue logo, South Dakota Voices for Justice, is our lobbying arm. So we do direct lobbying, and that's really where our story starts. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of the organization, and then we can dive into some immigration issues and questions and answers, hopefully. So in 2017, after the election cycle of 2016, pretty much knew that the rhetoric we were hearing on the federal campaign trail would be hitting us here in South Dakota too. So in my previous life, which was going to law school in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I worked for the city of Minneapolis and worked for a nonprofit organization that concentrated just on civil rights of Muslim Americans, American Muslims, and those who were thought to be Muslim in America through an organization called the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Minnesota chapter. So nobody here knew about my previous life until about 2016. 2017. And so I started to receive some phone calls about some really ugly legislation and resolutions that were targeting immigrants, refugees, and Muslims, specifically here in South Dakota. And so there was no organization or really no entity doing that work specifically here in South Dakota. So once I was called, I did what I knew to do, which is organize communities to be their voice. And that's what we did. We took refugees, immigrants, and Muslims to Pier, as you all know, in the winter months, which is death-defying in and of itself, to be our own voice, and to show our elected representatives, our legislators, that we do exist here in South Dakota too, though you may not know or may not realize the deep kind of immigrant roots, especially of Arab American migration, and Muslim and Arab Christians who have come and settled in what is today South Dakota, where we have probably close to 5 generations. Our 2 first Arab American members of Congress are from South Dakota in our country, Abaresk and Abner. So this is just really fascinating history and really trying to figure out how to tie it back. So from 2017 to 2019, we saw 12 pieces of legislation and resolutions that what we would call were bigoted and against immigrants, refugees, and Muslims. We have fought legislation that would make undocumented students ineligible to go to higher education here in our state. We fought legislation that would have forced local law enforcement to cooperate with ICE if asked about people's immigration status. And we also fought resolutions that claimed that Islam is a religion of terrorism, and that refugees should not be allowed into our state as well. So in that time, we've defeated 85% of what we call bigoted legislation and resolutions, and we're really proud of that work. So I know you all know the landscape of South Dakota legislature, and it's really, the work that we have done has really gained some national attention in terms of how are we working across the aisle, if you will, in such a conservative rural state. And my very simple answer is that we showed up. Our community showed up and they were their own voice. And we truly appreciate all of the work of our allies in this space over the years, but adding our faces to the names and to the people of South Dakota was really what I think was pivotal. And we heard from several legislators that it was really crucial for us to be there because they didn't realize how diverse our immigrant and refugee population was here in South Dakota. So since 2019, we have not seen legislation that directly targets immigrants, refugees, and Muslims. But as you know, we've seen them targeting different groups like our transgender family members in our state. So our vision for our state is really that it's diverse, inclusive, and anti-racist. And though we concentrate on lifting the voices of immigrant, refugee, and Muslims in our state, we walk alongside all people, all individuals and organizations that are fighting bigotry in our state so that we are building a strong state together. So kind of a couple highlights over the years, we started a digital storytelling project of immigrants, refugees, and Muslims in our state. We did halt that because of COVID, but you can see our digital storytellers on our website. We do civic engagement work in multiple languages. So you'll see Get Out the Vote videos in multiple languages. We had voter registration drives, similar to a lot of the things that the party does in general, but really reaching multilingual communities is our focus. And then we did census work, as Kellen mentioned, this past year as best we could through social media and digital tools. And with COVID, as we all pivoted personally and professionally and organizationally. We knew as we were hearing discussions of the first CARES Act during the Trump administration that they would be leaving out large swaths of our population, specifically undocumented immigrants. And there are undocumented residents here in South Dakota that work in ag, that work in the service sector, that are an integral part of our economies here in South Dakota. And we knew that mixed status immigration families, so that would be where if there's a married couple, one person would be a US citizen, for example, and the other spouse would be undocumented. So we knew that those families were also not going to be eligible for CARES COVID relief, as well as undocumented business owners, which we also have in our community, and so on and so on. So at that time, we were a staff of 2.5. With the outbreak of COVID in our meat processing plant here in Sioux Falls, Smithfield, we got together all of the people we work with in community, and we call ourselves the South Dakota Dream Coalition. So we're majority immigrant refugee led little organizations that you probably won't find a website for, as well as our allies who are doing immigrant service work in our state. And so we organized, we did a lot of media advocacy, really lifting the voices of Smithfield workers who were impacted by COVID directly, getting them all the way into BBC international news, which was really a big deal. And then most notably, our coalition got together and started the Emergency Relief Fund for immigrants in South Dakota. And so South Dakota Voices for Peace took the lead in staffing that Emergency Relief Fund and raising money. And I'm just like so honored and excited to say that we were able to raise $1.2 million in less than 6 months. And we distributed about 940,000 of those funds directly into the hands of immigrant-led households here in South Dakota. So we are oftentimes called a small organization, but mighty. We just happen to be in the right place in the right time. We're very strategic and we're very action oriented. And so that kind of leads me to our legal services. If you remember, if you can go back to around 2014, 2013, it was the first time we were seeing images of kids coming to our border, right, in the cages under the Obama administration and the influx of unaccompanied minors that we saw. And so unaccompanied minors is a legal term that means that these children are arriving at our border, our southern border, without parents or guardians. And that is a different issue from what we saw under the Trump administration zero tolerance policy, which was to separate children from the families they were coming with at the border. So those are two very separate issues. So in 2014, I had my private practice and I was starting to get calls from the Sioux Falls School District because they were seeing lots of kids without parents coming into the schools from what is called the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And they all come with the same manila envelope with all their paperwork from the detention centers that they're held in. And so they asked, what's going on? And we knew that what we were seeing at the border was impacting us here in South Dakota. So with lots of Band-Aid kind of fixes over the years, a group of some amazing women and activists in our communities, lawyers, pastors, just kind of everyone came together to understand this issue better. And I made the pitch that we needed to provide free legal services for these kids, because all of these kids, when you come to the border and you turn yourself into Customs and Border Patrol or Homeland Security officials, CBP officials, you're automatically put into immigration court proceedings. So all of these kids are in immigration court. And so immigration court is a very separate system from our criminal court system, our civil court system, if you will. And it's regional. So our court for South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota is located in Fort Snelling, Minnesota. So now imagine you're a 13-year-old who has crossed the border from Guatemala. You're now living in South Dakota, and I'll talk about that process in a second. And now you have to get to immigration court in Minneapolis, basically, and all the hurdles. And all the court stuff is in English. So someone has to figure out what all of this means. And the real danger is that if you don't show up to your court hearing dates, you will automatically be put into deportation proceedings, also now called removal proceedings in absentia. So basically the judge will say, oh, you didn't show up, so we're just going to order you removed. And that becomes really dangerous, especially here in South Dakota, because our law enforcement agencies have access to the federal database, if you will. And so if a kid gets picked up on something, and that law enforcement agent decides to look into the federal database and sees that they have a removal order, they would hand them straight over into ICE custody and they would be taken away. And that has happened, and it happens more often than we probably want to know about. So with the help of a lot of community support, we raised enough money to launch our free legal services program in November of 2019. Which I'm really proud about. We have 4 staff on our legal team, including myself. We have a legal intern and 2 case managers. 90% of our clients are unaccompanied minors from Central America. The other 10% we also serve through a different grant that we've been on for a while, is survivors of violence who are immigrants in our community. So the overwhelming majority of that pool of clientele are survivors of domestic violence, where their immigration status usually is used against them, right, in terms of the power imbalance and not reporting violence to law enforcement. So we are the only place in the state that offers free legal services to these 2 clientele pools. Since 2014, the Office of Refugee Resettlement actually tracks the number of children who are placed in different states. So just backing up a couple steps. So when a child enters the border, 99% of them are turning themselves into a CBP officials. So they're coming through a border checkpoint, right? They're not just running through the border to get to South Dakota as a child. That's almost like pretty much impossible to do. So these kids are turning themselves in. If they say some key words that would alert a CBP official that they may qualify for asylum, they would be put into a separate process to do what's called a credible fear assessment. And based on several federal litigation and settlement agreements and so on, there are time limits for how long a child can be placed in detention facilities. Though that's never usually met because it is an overwhelming situation at the border for the US government to find safe places for these children. And so the way that they do that is 90% of the time, these kids know someone in the United States. So that's the first question they get asked. If they know someone, so let's say, for example, Dave, your nephew had just crossed the border, then the Office of Refugee Resettlement takes over custody of these children and Health and Human Services, and they do a background check on Dave, and they make sure, he's okay to release this child to. So then these kids get shipped to where the sponsor is after they pass these background checks. And the sponsor's role is to make sure these kids stay out of trouble, that they go to school and show up to their immigration court hearing dates. If you can imagine just for a moment that many times sponsors themselves are undocumented, so they don't want to go to immigration court, right? So a lot of the times these kids end up in the shadows, if you will, along with their sponsors, even though these children have some very specific and special opportunities to a path to citizenship, but they don't know that until they get access to legal services. So that's why it's so critical to get to these kids specifically. So since 2014, we know there's over 500 unaccompanied minors from Central America living in South Dakota. And these kids are transient. And so, those numbers ebb and flow, but that's how many kids have been released to a sponsor in South Dakota. And if you just Google Office of Refugee Resettlement unaccompanied minors, you can find links to how many kids have been released state by state. And some of those more densely populated states, you can see county by county where they've been released to. So immigration is a very difficult process. There's just so many hoops to jump through. The law and policy and procedure is constantly changing. It is nearly impossible for kids to represent themselves, but they do, especially at the border. If you've seen images of children in immigration court representing themselves at ages, I think the youngest child who represented himself was 1 year old in immigration court, and that is literally what was happening at the border. And so right now we see what a lot of people are calling another surge. I would explain it to be the previous administration completely didn't follow international law or US law when it comes to seeking asylum. So according to international law, it is every person's right to come to a country's border and ask for protection from persecution. And there are several legal nuances on who qualifies for asylum, but everyone has that right to ask and then go through the process to see if they actually do qualify. It is a very high burden. The overwhelming majority of cases are not approved. I don't have those statistics in front of me, but I can get them to you if you're interested in terms of approval rates for asylum cases. But kids have another avenue to pursue citizenship, which is through something called special immigrant juvenile status. And those are the questions that we as lawyers vet. And we know now from statistics that if a child shows up to immigration court on their own without legal representation, it's a 90% chance that they will be returned to the country that they fled. But if they have a lawyer, they have a 40% chance of removal. Or another way of looking at it is a 60% chance of staying in this country lawfully with a path to citizenship. And it's really important to understand that not all paths lead to citizenship. You may have legal status, but you may not ever be able to get to citizenship. And our goal as attorneys is always to find a way for someone to become a citizen. So recently, the governor started tweeting a lot about illegals. And as a civil rights, human rights activist and immigration attorney, I vehemently oppose calling human beings illegals. They may be underdocumented or undocumented. The overwhelming majority of people who are undocumented in our country, that means that they do not have lawful permission to be here, actually arrived in our country lawfully through a visa. So if you've ever traveled internationally, you probably have had to have gotten a visa to travel there, a tourist visa. Similarly, people are coming here on tourist visas. They usually have a 60-day, 90-day kind of period of time where you can be here lawfully, but there's no process to make sure you leave when you're supposed to leave. And those are visa overstays. And those visa overstays are our undocumented population. And then we do have people who are crossing the border who do make their way through a a place of entry that is not a border checkpoint. And so that would be crossing unlawfully. That is against the law to cross into our country through a port that is not a border checkpoint. So the action may be unlawful, but you as a person can never be unlawful, right? And a common analogy that I make is when we break the speed limit, that's against the law, right? That doesn't make us any legal person. It just makes our act unlawful. So similarly, the governor tweeted that she would not be accepting illegals into our state. But what she didn't mention in her tweet is that the only people who are being allowed into our country right now are children. And so when President Trump decided not to follow international law for asylum, what he did is he made the bottleneck not at our border, but inside of Mexico. So he basically implemented something called MPP, and it was anybody who was coming to seek asylum at our border now have to wait in Mexico for their asylum court hearing date in the United States. So you can imagine how impossible it was for US attorneys to access their clients if they're in some sort of refugee installation or camp inside of Mexico. And it just became a very dangerous situation for these thousands and thousands of people who are coming up from Central America to be in Mexico. Without really any type of process in terms of when their case would be heard. So the first thing the Biden administration did really was to allow for the children to come to our border so that they were in a safer space than in one of those camps, if you will, in Mexico. And technically there is no way for anybody on our side of the hemisphere to be a refugee. A refugee is, again, another legal terminology of someone who is seeking asylum, but they're outside of the country. So if you think of refugee camps, you usually think of, the Middle East or North Africa, or Southeast Asia. There are refugee camps that have been built by the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And so that is the only way to become a refugee. So all of these kids, all of these adults, all of these people stuck in Mexico are not technically refugees. And if you have questions about that, I can answer them. So based on the previous administration's MPP protocol, which was largely based on COVID and not allowing COVID into our country, adults still are not being allowed inside of our border, just the kids are. So is the border open? No, it's not. It's open to children so that they have a safer environment. The other interesting caveat is that we learned that the Biden administration was asking governors of states to take in these kids so that there would be some alleviation of the surge at the border and overcrowding in detention centers and borders. And South Dakota was never asked to take in any kids. And so Governor Noem's tweet was very deceiving, just because of the time of it, and also because of the lack of information she included in the tweet as well. And then she kind of doubled down. Well, she didn't kind of, she did. She doubled down in her rhetoric of illegals not coming in, and that the border was totally out of control, and that terrorists were coming in through the southern border. And research shows that 2 men were apprehended at the southern border that were on a no-fly list, just to show that CBP was doing their job. But terrorists have not been flooding and coming into our country through the southern border. So again, really disappointing fear-mongering rhetoric that we saw from the governor for a couple of days. And then I think she was in Sioux Falls too and doubled down on the terrorism claim that was never backed up by any factual information on her end. So I just spoke for like 30 minutes straight. So, and I can keep going, but I'd love to open it up to questions if you all have. There was one thing I wanted to mention when there was some fear of ice raids, and ice raids have happened on ag farms, dairy plants, and meat processing plants across our region, and has happened here in South Dakota. There was a really interesting discussion of tribal nations opening up their borders to house undocumented people and have protection there. So I just thought that was interesting. That hasn't been a discussion that I know of here in South Dakota, but would be a really interesting one to have if people are interested. So
Taneeza, I've got a question for
yeah.
you. You do a really good job with your e-newsletters of sharing talking points when there are alerts and things people need to be aware of. Can you tell this group how they can sign up to get your emails, your alerts, so that they're able to get the great information and talking points that you put out there?
Absolutely. Yes, we are really good at rapid response action alerts. So if you go to our website, which I just dropped in the chat box, you will see a tab that says connect, and you can sign up for our newsletters. If you're on social media, please follow us on Facebook at South Dakota Voices for Peace, on Twitter or Instagram. That's where we're most dynamic, and that's where a lot of our rapid response work is happening. And then we share it with, I know the Dem Party has been wonderful in sharing our action alerts, as well as other groups on Facebook. And that's how it really, really does get out into the community. Yeah, so thanks. And I just saw another question about local media, and let me just go back to that. Local media's coverage, honestly, our bread and butter in terms of advocacy work has been through media advocacy. We release press statements and press releases and have local interviews on these issues. And the press has been really great about covering our side, if you will, and also covering, whatever the rhetoric is on the other side as well. So I feel local media does a pretty good job in covering issues that impact immigrant and refugee communities. And I'd like to say it's because we're making sure that they are.
I have a question for Taneeza. Yeah. Hi, this is Kellen. Can you elaborate a little bit on the and make a distinction between the policy that was occurring during the Obama administration with respect to kids coming and during the last administration? Because I think that there's a really interesting effort to try and make the similarities and to justify the latter for the actions of the Obama administration. So can you kind of elaborate on that for us a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. There's a lot of nuances, right? But not to get like totally into the nitty gritty. But when a family comes to the border, right, pre-Trump administration, when a family would come to the border, the men would be separated from the women and children because of how the detention facilities are set up. Right? So men would be sent to a detention facility. Women and children would always be together and sent to a different facility while this immigration process came through. So oftentimes what would happen is if a family raised issues about seeking protection from persecution and asked for asylum, they would be released on bail, right? And so many people who come to our border wear ankle monitors, and that's how they are released. And then they have to check in with ICE in wherever they move to on a regular basis. So women and children were always separated from men, right? But the difference, that's just the standard policy. The difference was in the 6 weeks zero tolerance policy that was instituted by the Trump administration. The specific purpose of that policy was to deter other people from not coming to our country. I mean, that was clearly stated by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, right? That policy was to separate children from their mom and dad, to be a deterrent for other people to not come to our border. And then there was also no system in place as we learn more and more about the ramifications of what's called the zero tolerance policy. There was no system put in place to track children and kids children and parents when they were separated, right? So what was happening is that parents were being deported and their kids were here because they have extra protections as minors. And then they didn't know how to reunite them, right? And then you started hearing these stories about nonprofit organizations like knocking on doors in Guatemala to see if their kids were still in the US. There was no way to reunite these children. And we see that impact. I think there's still like 65 kids from that horrendous policy from almost 2.5, 3 years ago now that still have not been reunited with their parents. So that is the major difference. And so I imagine that once the border is open again and families start coming together, that men will be separated from women and children, because that's how the detention facilities are made. And then they reunite once they're all released and go to where they go to together.
I don't see another hand up, so I'm going to do a follow-up to that. I read the book Separated. I'm not sure if you've seen that or read that book. It's from Jacob Sokoloff. He's the MSNBC news reporter. He released it in November, and it's surrounding his personal account and his all of the things that he witnessed while he was reporting on the border crisis, during that period where that policy was being implemented. Do you know of any other, you mentioned a number, but in his book, and I think in some of maybe the reporting after, is that number of kids who actually have never been reunited, is there any validity or truth to the rumor, I guess you could say, that all of the information pertaining to the possibility of reconnecting them with their families has been either destroyed or just wasn't even kept all together? Is there any other information regarding that?
I mean, there's lawsuits, right? ACLU instituted lawsuits, other immigrant rights advocacy groups instituted lawsuits on figuring out what was the process, when these kids were separated and how they were going to be reunited. So I am not well versed in that and all the developments around it, but there's a lot of litigation to be determined, right, in terms of remedies to these families. The most recent thing I heard under the current administration is the Biden administration set up a task force, right? So the previous administration, nonprofit organizations tried to figure out where families were because of the government's program, right? But now it's the government that has a task force to find where these families are and how to reunite them with kids. And so kind of that first wave of families has been found, and they are being allowed to come into the United States to be reunited with their families. The next step will be, in terms of remedies, I would advocate, if I could, on a national level, that these families should have a path to citizenship because of the horrific conditions that they've had to live through for the last 3 years being separated from their children. And, there's a lot of just horror stories about how if these children's parents were not found, they were put into the US foster system. But these are children who have parents, right, that were separated and deported by the US government. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that litigation shakes down and what comes out of it.
Thank you. It looks like Pam has her hand up next. Pam?
Yeah, Thank you, Taneeza. The South Dakota is we're just so proud of you, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. In a more perfect world, what do you think that our immigration policy should look like? You kind of talked about the pathway to citizenship. Are you happy with the direction that Biden's heading? And I can't claim that I've read the entire his policy on that yet, but if you could write the policy, what basically could we do as a country? What should we be doing? And then how can we really help other countries that are struggling, to help them, become more stable? Because there's two parts to that, right? There's that ongoing disruption in many countries that is a variety of situations going on. But so that balancing that out, how do you see this pathway of citizenship, some steps that we could take and helping other countries, but then personally, what could we do individually?
Well, geez, Pam, way to lay on the question there. Yeah, I mean, foreign policy, like that's not my forte, even though that was my undergrad degree. But Central American foreign policy needs to be revamped. And I think there are current efforts in looking at that. Am not well versed in foreign policy as it pertains to Central America, but I know it's a big part of why all of these people are coming to our border, right? So I agree. I mean, I think of all issues as a continuum. It's never like one issue or a black and white issue. It's a lot of gray and a lot of different things that are going on. In terms of, I mean, the immigration system is so broken. I mean, I just can't even, it's like a patchwork quilt. Like one thing happened, so a whole set of rules and laws came out. Then another administration came and like revamped all the rules. It's just a complete disaster, right? And for attorneys, we just have to do what we can with the rules that we have to follow. I will say, in a perfect world, I think the argument that in the United States, and specifically in South Dakota, we need more people to come in to our state to make it economically viable. It's just math, right? And I think the Federal Reserve chair from Minneapolis came to a Sioux Falls Rotary meeting 2 years ago. And was like, guys, let's just do the math. People in South Dakota are dying at a faster rate than people coming in. So who's going to do this work, right? It's not going to be people from Chicago who's going to do this work. And so I think it's really important to understand the economic needs of our state and our country as a whole, and to provide those visas. I mean, the visa system for ag workers is ridiculous, right? Like they can apply to come for 4 or 5 months, then they have to go back, and then their employer has to reapply, and then they have to go back, and they have to reapply.
Let's hop on a Zoom.
If they want to just
I'm wondering.
lawful status, right? And there are millions of undocumented people in our community that have been here for years. There are children who have been brought here when they were babies. This is the only country they know to be home. They're oftentimes referred to as dreamers or DACA recipients. I mean, it's almost like a no-brainer. Like, why wouldn't we give them US citizenship, right? Or a pathway to citizenship? There's a lot of argument, well, they broke the law. But I think undocumented people who work pay taxes, right? Like they get all of those taxes we get out of our paycheck, regardless of if they're undocumented or not. And then we'll never see that money. They don't get Social Security because of the way they have to get their ITIN numbers and Social Security numbers to work, right? So it's really important. American Immigration Council has a lot of great statistics state by state on the undocumented population's economic value and how much tax revenue and business revenue our immigrant communities bring into the state of South Dakota. And, though I don't love just talking about the economic, talking about people as economic commodities, I mean, there's obviously so much to say about the richness of cultures and diversity that comes with immigrants coming to our state. And South Dakota is really interesting because we have this kind of underground, undocumented population, these ag workers, these kids who have no status. But then we have these super highly skilled immigrants too, right? Working in our health sector, and our energy and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting mix of immigrants that are in our state specifically, and what that looks like. But there's not enough jobs in the United States that wouldn't warrant the need for more immigrants coming here. So I think there should be a process, but I don't think we should make it so hard for people to come here to work, to decide to live, to decide to have a family, to decide to get educated. I think it doesn't need to be so difficult.
I don't see any other questions, so I'll just keep asking questions until I see. This is Kellen again. So you mentioned that there was 85% of the legislation that was defeated, correct?
Mhm.
And so I guess I'm not necessarily well versed in that particular legislation either. So can you tell me what that 15% of that legislation, or what those, I guess, the highlights of those, and how your organization, specifically is dealing with the aftermath?
Of the bills
The
that
one that passed, yeah.
Yeah, so honestly, it's a little deceiving, that number, because the 2 or 3 bills that we can't count as defeating were just amended. They were amended to a place where there was one bill specifically in 2018 that targeted refugees, and Lutheran Social Services is our only refugee resettlement agency in our state. So all refugees have to come through a refugee resettlement agency. And then they get placed and then they get services through that resettlement agency for like up to a year, depending on the agency. So LSS was comfortable with the amendments that were made to a particular bill. So we can't call it as we defeated it because it still passed, but it was amended, if you will. But if you go to our website for our C4, which is South Dakota Voices for Justice.org, and I'm going to drop it right now. You can see all of our legislative history by year in our lobbying tab and see what bills we did defeat and which bills were what we designate in the yellow. I'm trying to remember what 2 bills we couldn't. Oh, there was a couple resolutions. There was one resolution that declared where the legislature, I think it was the House side, where it started, was pledging allegiance to Israel. And we opposed that, but it passed. And that happens almost every year. So those are the types of resolutions and bills that we were not able to defeat. But the substantive legislation, right, which would have like forced local law enforcement to work with ICE or would deny access to higher education for undocumented students, or one of the bills, and I laugh because it's just comical at points how bigotry goes, but the bill was to assure that refugees couldn't come into South Dakota. And I remember testifying against it, and it was a bill that was authored by Stace Nelson, for those of you who know. I was super nervous to testify because he could ask anything, right? And I can't remember who it was, but there was another senator who was like, is it possible to make sure that refugees don't come into our state? And I said, unless we put a border around our state and have like checkpoints with customs and border officials, I'm not sure how it would be possible, right? It's a fundamental right in our Constitution that once you're inside the United States, you have a right to travel. You have a right to go anywhere. So once you're in You can go anywhere you want and no one can tell you that. And so that again goes against the underlying theme with the governor's tweets, right? Like, I'm not going to let any illegals into our state. Well, how are you going to do that? They're already here, right? And they're part of this economy. They're part of our community with restaurants and shops and school. They've revived several of our dying rural communities, right? There's a huge influx of immigrants right now in Flandreau, right? It's like crazy how many how the Flandreau School District is trying to figure out ESL classes for this huge influx over the last 2 years. So immigrants are reviving rural America, and I don't know how we make that shift when the rhetoric is just so demonizing.
It looks like we have time for one more question, and Pam, I guess we're gonna.
Unless somebody else has a question.
I don't see anybody else's hand, so we got a few minutes here left.
So a comment first. I think the term ICE is terrible, and I wish that could be renamed. Enforcement is just not a word. I think that needs to be in that acronym. But my question is, what options do undocumented people and even new Americans that are here on visas, what kind of healthcare options do they have?
Undocumented people do not have access to healthcare. So there's undocumented, there's people who are here lawfully but temporarily, like students, for example. They may qualify for some sort of healthcare through their international programs at their schools, for example. And then there's people who are refugees that come, they're here lawfully, and their next step would be getting what's called a green card. And then after 5 years of getting their green card, they can apply for citizenship and they are eligible for healthcare. But a lot of the times, undocumented people who are having families in our community, their children, if they're born in the United States, are eligible for Medicaid. So that's how they would have access to some benefits if it's through a US born child. Now that's a state by state thing too, right? Like there are some states that provide access to the Affordable Care Act to undocumented people. I think California does. And similarly for undocumented students, right? So these kids who were brought into this country when they were 4 or 5 years old, right? With no legal status, this is the only home they know. If they want to go to college, they have to pay full tuition because they're not eligible for federal loans. So it goes on and on.
Well, I don't see any other hands at this moment. So we are coming up on our time. We have the, looks like the link for the Voices for Justice in the chat. We also have a couple of other links specifically regarding to a couple of the questions that Taneeza answered earlier also. I want to thank you for coming to our little caucus presentation and sharing with us, all the information. I hope that you are able to come back again sometime whenever, it would be, we can get more of our group and our community, together. And because I think that creating a partnership with our caucus and with the immigrant community and all the advocates and all of our allies, I think that we could create partnerships and we can be really impactful and ensure that all the things that matter and we have in relation and share, that we could approach those and get some action and some solutions. So I want to thank you again, everyone who participated. Come back again next week. We will have another speaker in our ongoing series every Tuesday for as long as everyone can attend and participate. And so without further, I want to thank you again, and we will see everybody soon. Have a good evening.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.